Welcome back to Inside the Circle podcast. I'm your host, Dara Loudon, joined by my co-host, Josie Stowers, our marketing ops coordinator. And on this podcast, we talk about interesting people, places, and really anything to do with the Western industry. Today, we have an extraordinary guest, Gillian Larson, and she is a Thru Rider, and she is going to explain all about what that entails. But the biggest story from Gillian is that she has ridden from Mexico to Canada, not once or twice, but actually 4 times. And so today we are going to dive into her story.
Thank you guys for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Of course. So Gillian, we are beyond excited to talk to you today. Let's start at the beginning. What first ignited your passion to take a long distance trail ride, and what are your favorite parts that keep you going on this through riding journey?
It definitely was kind of a timing thing for why I did it the very first time. I had just finished my undergraduate degree, or at least when it popped into my head, I was at the tail end of my undergrad. I had studied abroad for 6 months in Australia the year before, and so I kind of had, some time abroad, and it was a great experience, but I very much missed my horses. And so when I was kind of coming to the tail end of my undergraduate degree and I was kind of already accepted into a grad program for the following year, so I kind of, feel like I'm on a certain train track and I'm feeling kind of burnt out after getting towards the tail end of my undergrad. And I just kind of know that I'm a little worried that I am gonna burn out. And I just felt like I needed kind of like a reset. And I felt that international travel, which is kind of like the cliche thing to do when you feel like you need a life reset, wasn't really going to be the thing for me, because when I was studying abroad, I really missed my horses, and not having that piece of my life not available to me, it then made it a sort of not super fulfilling thing. So I kind of was ixnay on the going international thing, and so I was very much looking for a certain something that was going to kind of like fill this gap between, I knew I was going to graduate in December for my undergrad, and then end of August I was going to be enrolled in a master's program. So I already had in my life this kind of like set window of like, what are you going to do with this time, and how are you going to make it fulfilling and like recharge yourself and not have anything to do with academia. So very much like was looking for something. And I was out on a overnight like backpacking trip with my mom, and she had read an article in the LA Times about a woman who had just set the a speed record for hiking Mexico to Canada. And so she was telling me about this woman who hiked it in, I think under 50 days. I can't remember. This was back in 2013. And that was amazing to hear that. But the part that like really blew my mind was that there was even a trail that existed that went Mexico to Canada. I was like, there's one designated trail that goes Mexico to Canada. And I loved trail riding. I had a really amazing mare who just seemed to have like a bottomless, engine that just would not quit. And so it was just kind of that, absolute like cliche light bulb moment of like, that's the thing I want to do. I didn't even know at the time if horses could go on the trail. And obviously we're out, backpacking, so I have no internet. I can't just like, ask Google, like, can horses go on the trail? And so that was like the number one thing. I was like, even when we were out there, I was like, if horses can do this trail, it was the Pacific Crest Trail that my mom was talking about. I was like, I'm going to do it. Like, that's what I'm going to do. Before I knew anything about it, like I had already kind of like set my brain to it of like, that's what we're going to do if horses are allowed to do it, without any knowledge about what I was actually like kind of aiming for. that was very surface level. And I learned a lot, like, going into it. And it was very much a like hard learning curve to adapt to. I had absolutely zero experience in terms of backcountry stuff or even riding in the mountains. And even I keep saying, me and my mom were on a backpacking trip, and it was not a real backpacking trip, like by like especially my standards now. Like we were going to a camp that was in the backcountry where they give you the food and they give you a wall tent, and all you're bringing with you is like the clothes on your back. And that was literally the extent of my backpacking experience. I had never even boiled water in the backcountry. I'd set up tents before in the front country because I did field research when I was studying biology, but never like had to carry a tent with me and set up a tent in the backcountry, had never done anything with keeping horses in the backcountry, like absolutely nothing. So I was starting from like below ground zero. And so while I was doing my first ride, it was a really, really steep learning curve. And I think the thing that really kept me going, because I cried like every single day, for sure. Like every day had these like really good peaks, like emotionally and physically.
I love your honesty.
Yeah,
You
and
know, it's not just all just this, you know, freedom and magic.
Yes,
and-
Yeah,
you see the beautiful pictures, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of other things that go in.
yeah, it is. And that tends to be very much like it's kind of romanticized and the idea of it, and then the actuality of it tends to be a very sharp contrast to what people. And I kind of knew going into it that I was under no disillusions of how naive I was, and I was young. I was 22, and so that's, you know, almost kind of nice. I'm not expected to know a whole lot at age 22, and so I was perfectly content with my status as being a total noob, and I just kind of embraced that part of it. And so I was very willing to like make mistakes and learn from them and try to change. And so the thing that really kept me going was being okay with that, being okay with, I tried to not have expectations. I tried to understand that I had no possibility of imagining what it was going to be like. So I really tried to be very, very open-minded and not have an expectation. And I think that was healthy, because I didn't have an over-romanticized idea. I really tried to not even envision what it was going to be like out there, because I felt like it was just going to set me up for kind of that mental failure. I read something too, because there's a lot of like backpacker blogs, but there's not a lot of horse stuff. So a lot of the backpackers were kind of, I was reading a lot of their blogs, and a lot of them would talk about how to like not quit on a bad day. That, you know, that's not, you want to quit on a day when stuff isn't going wrong, because that's probably then more in alignment with like, okay, it's really not for you. You're really not enjoying the experience. But if you quit on a bad day, like, do not just, you know, give it 24 to 48 hours. Like, don't quit in a bad moment. And so I really tried to also internalize that of, you know, because I would have a lot of bad moments and a lot of times where I did want to quit. And I kind of learned too while I was out there, there were so many things that were out of my control that could end the trip. Like if a horse gets hurt and can't physically continue, if I just simply run out of days, like the snow comes early, or I just don't have the physical ability to complete that amount of miles in that window. There were so many things that could end it for me, that I kind of decided I really didn't want to be another obstacle in my own path. Like I didn't want to be a reason that I quit. Like there was enough reasons to quit. And so I kind of internalized that mindset of like, I don't want to be an unnecessary obstacle in my own path. And I don't want to quit in a bad day. So between those two things, they kind of like kept me on track to make it through the daily cry sessions.
Great philosophy just in life.
Yeah.
In general.
Sounds like you've
you
really
know?
been able to gain a lot of mental strength by going through this. Like,
Yeah. It
That's
has been a huge perspective shift, especially too, because some of my favorite moments on trail have been when quote unquote things have gone wrong earlier in the day. Like it was very, very common almost every single day on my first Mexico to Canada ride, where I would arrive well after dark to my campsite. And so, you know, either like I was getting, especially too, because you know, you kind of get on a bad cycle of like coming into camp late, but wanting to give the horses enough rest. So then you're leaving camp kind of late in the morning, and it just is once you kind of get on that track, it's hard to get off of it when you're doing high mileage each day. So it was pretty common for me to come into camp late, but even if, you know, you run into down trees and it stalls you for a couple hours to get through some obstacles, it was just very common to come in late to camp. And it would be easy to get in a bad mindset early on in the day of, oh, another day where something went wrong and I'm coming into camp late and it's going to be like cold and dark. But I would then end up having the most like incredible sunsets, like to where instead of being kind of like down in camp under the trees where you can't see like some sort of amazing view, I'd be up on top of the tippy top of a mountain trying to come off of it when the sun would be setting, and it would just be so gorgeous that like it ended up becoming like my favorite time of day. So it was almost then be this like, okay, things went really wrong, but I'm gonna get to watch a great sunset. And it just definitely allowed me to try to not let a bad moment create a bad day. Like, okay, I had a bad moment, but I'm still gonna have other good moments. And it
Yes.
was, like I said, a lot of peaks and valleys, like mentally and emotionally. And I really tried to not let the valleys of the day, take away from like the highs.
Yes.
And so yeah, it did build a lot of like just like mental like strength for sure while I was out there. Because I cried, like I said, pretty much every day of the first ride. But after that first ride, all my other ones, after having like that a different perspective, very little crying. Very little crying happens now. The really, really, really bad days, I'll still cry in a bad moment, but it's not a daily occurrence.
Right. So you've completed this ride 4 times. What does it take to prepare for this journey mentally, physically, and logistically?
Definitely the physically and the mentally are lower tier compared to the logistics. I think the logistics is the biggest component.
And it sounds like you overcame so much of that on your first
Yeah,
ride.
yeah. The first ride I was definitely unprepared in like every single category imaginable. Again, mostly because I grew up in the Los Angeles area. I had never ridden in the mountains. I had so little concept of just how that environment even is or looks like. And again, zero perspective. So I didn't try to imagine it because I was like, I'm gonna be way off base.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna save myself the like having to readjust it, and I'm just going to go into it as open-minded as I possibly can. So mentally and physically, I guess mentally that's kind of how I prepared for the first one, of just really trying to stay open-minded. And I did as much research as I could, but very little was out there at the time. So I was, researching like the backpackers and trying to, anticipate what, if that's their problems, how is it going to affect horses? And unfortunately, what a backpacker struggles with is very different than what like a horseback rider struggles with. So it's very, very different. You can't do too much comparison when it came to like, thinking about what kind of gear I wanted to bring. That's where the backpacker blogs were a little helpful, but outside of that, it's not as, translatable. Physically, I wanted to do a lot more prep than I did because I had a horse that was coming off an injury the very first time. So I felt very underprepared physically on that side of things. So I really just kind of went into it slowly and just let the horses kind of like adapt as they were getting going. And that's usually the best advice I can give for at least physically preparing is do what you can, at home, and then just start off slow and build up to it over a couple weeks. And then logistically, for the first ride, I complete a wash. Like absolutely nothing that I did logistically really like played out the way I thought it was going to. But after that first one and having that understanding, then I was able to be very logistic heavy on all of my other long distance rides where I can pretty much plan every single day in terms of what camps I'm going to, what kind of like water and food situation we're gonna likely encounter. All of that I basically plan like at home on my couch before I get out on trail these days. And so I do kind of have like a day by day itinerary that I really try to stick to. And I do stick to those very heavily. On my first ride, I would absolutely not have stuck to any kind of itinerary. There were times where I was, if my mom was, she was a teacher. And so she had like some time available during the summer. And I remember there was a time on the first ride where she was out there in the summer. And we started off in like one state, and then by like at the beginning of the morning we were gonna like had this one goal. I was gonna ride a certain distance. That completely failed for snow. And then I thought I was gonna go somewhere else to a different trailhead. Nope, that one was also like too snowy. And then we went to a whole other state by the time that night came, where I had other problems earlier in the season that I was like, oh, I'll come back to it. So then I went back to that. But it was like 3 times in one day. I thought I had like a plan, and then before I know it, like I'm ending up in a different state than I thought I was going to be in. So yeah, it was completely off the walls logistics the first time, but got a lot better once I had understood what the conditions were like, and also had a better way of properly researching conditions and stuff and making accurate predictions of what the conditions I would be facing. So it got a lot better. And logistically, I love planning out the trips. And a lot of it comes down to, too, every person has unique goals and unique resources. And I really try to encourage, it shouldn't be like a replicable experience. Like even from my first, second, third, fourth Mexico to Canada rides, my logistics looked a little different, like because I had different resources. You know, the resources I had at 22 looked very different than the resources I had at like, how old was I? 30, 31 on my last Mexico to Canada ride. And so they 30, I guess I was 30. So they looked very different. And therefore, like my strategy looked a little different. And someone else's ride from Mexico to Canada is probably going to look different than how I did it because you have different goals and different resources available to each person. And so that's very much kind of how I kind of look at it logistically is what are my goals? What kind of resources do I have? How can I make it the most positive experience possible for me and my horses?
So obviously your horses are kind of at the heart, of your rides and just truly what you enjoy in life. How do you select your horses, start to train, and like get them prepared for, kind of the aspects that you do know of the trail, but for things that you don't kind of know?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, especially too because on my first one, I very much lucked out with already having a really solid mare to where I heard about this and it was like, oh, that's the thing she's going to be good at. You know, like I remember kind of always struggling to figure out where she and I kind of like fit in beforehand. We were always kind of like the loners at my college of like being the only two that would try to go out and like knock out 15 miles between our morning and evening class. Like no one else is trying to go knock out 15 miles, you know, on like the cattle pastures behind campus during that. So I always knew that she had talents, but I wasn't sure where they fit into it. And it ended up for sure, absolutely being her talents. She did these Mexico to Canada rides. She did 3 of them, and she did them at age 16, 18, and 20.
Wow.
Like so she was a unicorn at that. And so she did also then help me kind of like set a bar for what I was looking for. She thrived out there and every day was just ready to go. And so that's for sure something I look for in horses now is I want a certain drive to where they like to go do a hard day's work. Like they just have that easy to access energy that's just like long lasting stamina. I've also grown to appreciate how, because I didn't know it at the time, but my horses, they always made me feel very safe. And I was aware of that, but I didn't always realize how kind of unique that trait can be. Like when things would be going wrong and you'd be in a dangerous situation or you're getting around bad obstacles, snow fields. Um, my horses, my main 2 that I took on a lot of my Mexico to Canada rides, they never like lost their cool. They always stayed very like grounded and they always looked to me to help them and it was very easy. Like they trusted me a lot and they were in a bad situation, they were not making things worse. And then, you know, when I started to get older and have new horses come into my life, that was then something I realized I needed to be better about prioritizing was some horses when things go wrong, they're kind of like pouring gasoline on a fire and like they will make things worse. And you do need a horse that you feel is going to keep their cool and like you two are going to help keep each other safe and not, you know, make a bad decision. Like some horses will kind of get panicky and they will make a very bad decision. And so I really learned to better prioritize horses who could stay with me mentally when I needed them to and that we could keep each other safe. And so that's something that I really look for in a horse. I look for, yeah, that good stamina. And then physically, there's for sure some traits I look for. I had kind of like some, you know, horses that ran on the leaner side. And so keeping their weight up was a big challenge on a lot of my rides. Whereas now, if I try to find horses that just naturally have a little bit more meat on their bones and just make that part of the logistics a little easier on myself. So yeah, those are kind of the things that I look for in horses. And then training wise, just spend a lot of time in the mountains and really just making sure that that's something that they thrive in and, you know, mentally kind of like stay happy doing.
They're used to that. Yes, that makes sense. And so, kind of touching on that, nutrition, conditioning, and equipment obviously play a huge role in safety and success when you're hitting the trail. So, what are some critical critical things that you consider from those aspects before you start your trail rides?
That's a good question. Nutrition is very kind of like individual for the horse.
Yes.
I have a mule now, and she is, I call her a fluffy rhinoceros because she is just a little tank. And so she needs very little help from me nutritionally to maintain her physique. So she doesn't need much. As long as she has something to chew and eat and put in her tummy, she's happy.
Yeah.
So she doesn't need like a high quality food. So regardless, as long as there's grazing of some sort, she's pretty content. If there's, you know, if we're in like the Mojave Desert or the Arizona desert and there's literally nothing, then I do make sure I'm bringing, 20, 25 pounds of like a hay pellet. But she just needs, something roughage based. Some of my other horses, especially the ones that like just, need like some alfalfa or something at home to kind of keep their weight good on the trail, then I have to really prioritize like a higher protein, higher fat, ratio in their diet to just keep their condition and their top line and their muscling where I want it. So I do very much kind of cater to the individual needs, and you can kind of tell from how they maintain their weight at home. If you kind of have to always keep them on a diet at home, that's going to be probably a good sign that they're not going to need as much help in the backcountry. If at home you're having to give them some, higher calorie feed or some alfalfa to keep their weight where you like it, that means you're probably going to have to put a little more effort too if you're asking them to cover 25 miles a day in the backcountry. Yeah. So I really, again, meet just the individual needs of each animal. And then, of course, there's always what you want your horse to eat, and then there's what they will eat for some of them. Some are pickier than others, so you kind of have to experiment sometimes with like palatability wise. If you don't have a total just like little piggy of a horse like my mule, what will they eat when they're out there? Because eating something is better than eating less, even if it's more like what you would like them to eat. Right. Just eating something's by far the most important. And then was the second part conditioning wise that you had asked? So conditioning wise, lots of walking. And again, some horses too take to, kind of going cold turkey, if you will, better than others. My mule's always been one of those creatures where it's like she can be pulled out of pasture and go do a hard day's work and not have it negatively affect her. And then you have some horses that very much need to be legged up. Otherwise, after they do a hard day's work, like, they are not going to be recovering well that night and they're going to really struggle. So again, some horses need more help than others to get to a place where they're going to be able to, go do a hard day's work. Others, you can get by with a little bit less conditioning if you're, hard on time. I have quite a few horses, and so for sure my mule is lower on my priority list when it comes to preconditioning than some of my horses that I really feel like if I don't get them to a certain fitness, it's gonna, do them a real disservice when we try to start getting into higher mileage. So again, I kind of like do triage of who needs my time and to get most in shape and just trying to put in those hours. And then gear wise, I kind of have a saying of, go light, go far. On a lot of my Mexico to Canada rides, because they were such high mileage days, I've really went into it with that mindset of, I want to bring as little as possible and just the necessities and bring, like feed often for like the kinds of rides I was doing and for the horses that I started out with. I had to bring a lot of heavy nutritional feed for them. Yeah. And so I needed to be able to have the capacity to carry 100 pounds of food, which means then for my own luxuries, I needed as like lightweight and really just the bare necessities. So I usually joke when it comes to like my gear that I'm like a backpacker on a horse. Like I'm not bringing heavy luxury items. There's no cast iron skillet in my pack saddle. Like I'm just eating the backpacker dehydrated food. I have the backpacker tent, the backpacker sleeping bag, sleeping pad, everything's very light. And I do kind of think that I'm like a weird packer hybrid where I don't have a lot of the gear for myself that like a typical packer brings. I lean towards a backpacker style of human gear. And then I have obviously the horse stuff is a bit more like practical for the horses because that can be a little harder to get lightweight. And so I have a lot of kind of like MacGyvered horse gear to try to help with the weight category. So that's kind of like the gear side is where I'm usually going is what do I really need and how can I make it as light as possible but still functional?
So through all of your travels that you really advocate for responsible trail riding and are willing to share your knowledge and help other people because there wasn't a lot of resources when you got started. So can you just share a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I felt, like I said, when I was kind of getting into it, that there was a real lack of just easy to access knowledge, especially for where I was growing up. There was not a person that I felt like I could just, reach out to for that kind of knowledge. Um, and even the knowledge that was out there, it's very, very traditional, which I think is important to make sure we don't lose the heritage of horse packing. But for doing, the kinds of mileage that I was doing, I felt like I just needed a little bit, of a twist on it. Kind of like the endurance riding. So, I was really trying to pick knowledge from backpackers, from horse packers, from endurance riders, and just really trying to figure out what was the right mix that I needed for myself. And I felt like especially to where I was coming from in Los Angeles, unlike a horse packer that maybe lives in Wyoming, we don't have the space or the land or the finances to have a string of horses. And so how could I, again, with what I had, how could I make it work rather than trying to just replicate someone else's system? And so I felt like there was kind of a little niche, gap in the, packing industry, because you can nowadays find it's more readily accessible pack clinics and that kind of knowledge. But if you are growing up or you live in like an urban environment and you only have one horse and you're wanting to go out for like a night or two in the backcountry, you're not going to, and only a few times a year, you're not going to want to go spend the finances to get another equine and all the pack gear. And how can you take what you have and, with as little modifications as possible, depending on what your abilities are, make it work for you? And so I really try to help riders teach that. I offer some workshops where I basically go over kind of, the logistics. And I always felt too, when people were learning to pack, they were kind of always having to get their resources from other equestrians. Like, they felt like they needed to ask other equestrians, where do you ride? Where do you camp? And if you don't have that network, how do you get access? And so I really try to teach people with on their own, how can they look at a map and how can they determine where is it safe to camp? How can you research on your own places to ride without having to feel like if you don't have a network of people, you can't do something or have a mentor. So I really try to teach like self-sufficiency in terms of even just the research side of it and feeling competent that you are not going in blind somewhere. So I think that's a little bit of a unique thing that I really try to help riders is the prep and the planning side, and especially traveling in so many different environments. I'm not kind of like locked in on the idea of like, oh yeah, there's always going to be a meadow that you camp in the meadow and you turn your horses out and that's it. I understand that people travel in different environments and that there's different pros and cons to certain containment. And so I've tried a lot of things and I really try to explain like the why behind something, not just like teach the how and expect people to replicate it. It's like, here's why. Here's why you might choose this containment over another containment for where you're riding and like how you're doing it. So I really try to bring that kind of holistic option to it, and then help people, if they're doing things a little unconventionally, that how it still would be doable for them. So that's really the kind of like what I try to help bring into the equation, as well as teaching, kind of like leave no trace. And again, some of the backpacker ethos that they have when they're going in the backcountry. Horses are big animals. We can have sometimes a big impact, and you want to minimize its negative implications for the environment when you're going out there, especially because some of these environments in the high country can be really fragile. And it's good to be mindful of, how can you have as least of a negative impact as possible when traveling out there. So I really try to also just bring that mentality into it, because I didn't know that myself, and it's also been like a learning, how can I do this in a better way for my horses, for the environment? How can I make sure these places that I love going to remain as beautiful as I remember them?
That's so valuable.
And don't you post all that on your website, right? Like your workshops, and what's your web address or your?
My website is gillianlarson.net. And then I also, usually like will share about upcoming workshops and offerings. I also do some guided trips for people that have attended like a workshop. Because again, if you don't have a network, it can be very intimidating to go out on your own for the first time. And so I try to help people just kind of have like a soft launch, or we call it like a shakedown trip, where it's like you get to go out there without a lot of the stress of the unknown and just see how you and your horse and your gear kind of like work and what things you might want to tweak. But it's just kind of a way to just help make things also just a little safer for people. So yeah, I really try to make it accessible for people to get out there. But I talk about that stuff on mostly my Instagram, is my main social media platform, and then also my website stays up to date whenever I have things that are available.
That's amazing. So one of the questions that I've really been wanting to ask is, you've obviously seen some beautiful, breathtaking scenery. Do you have like a specific favorite moment or story that has stuck with you throughout all your journeys?
Probably, in terms of like story-wise, one of my favorites was all my best stories are usually from that first, Mexico to Canada ride, because usually when things are going wrong, it makes for the best stories. So I was in northern Washington, and so I'm like less than a week away from reaching Canada. I am so close. And on the Pacific Crest Trail, I usually say that like the last 250 miles of Washington is like trial by fire. It's very not hot. It's usually trial by like rain and snow, but it's the hardest part. And I feel like the PCT, it's almost like, boiling a frog in water, where like the beginning starts off pretty nice and kind of gradually it gets you into it. And then by the time, if I'd gone Canada to Mexico, I don't think I ever would have made it, because like northern Washington would have just like smacked me down like immediately and been like, no. But going the other way, I had kind of overcome enough obstacles and tweaked enough things that I was like, I stood like a small chance of making it through northern Washington. And so I just was finishing up a section that was like the hardest couple days I'd ever had. It was raining terribly. I had gotten way behind schedule coming into my next resupply. And so I had gone through horrible trees that had really slowed me down. And on this, like the day that I'm coming into this resupply, I had like 30 miles. I got started at 5 a.m. I had trees in the morning, and I had to do, I forget exactly how many miles it was, but it was 30 something miles. And around like 6 p.m., when I think I still had, 16 miles to go, the rain had started, and I didn't make it into the resupply like area until 2 in the morning, and it had just been dumping for the last 8 hours. I'm soaking wet, and it was this like ranger station, this Forest Service ranger station, where they had a little like corral to the side that you could put your horse in. It was this is probably the most unique resupply area on the whole trail, because there's no roads to access it. There's a little town, it's called Stehekin, and you get to this town by horse, foot, plane, or ferry. So there's no roads. And the only people who are allowed to have vehicles in this town are residents. And there was a ranch down the road that I had reached out ahead of time and was like, can I have like a bale of hay? Like, and can I mail you guys horse feed? I was traveling with just one horse. And so I could only carry a few days of food on her. And I was like, can I mail you guys food? Because I'm going to need to resupply here before our last push to Canada. And he was like, yes. So I like mailed him like 40 pounds of like horse feed. And then he brought a bale of hay out, and he had, wrapped it in a tarp and then hung it from a tree to keep the deer from getting it. And so it's like at 2 a.m., like I'm like cutting down this bale of hay for my horse and getting her all settled. And I'm like so proud of myself that we made it. Like I'm like on a high, like an adrenaline, dopamine high of like, it's 2 a.m., we made it, we're here. And the way you get to town, which is like a few miles away, there's like this amazing like bakery. And so I'm just so excited to go to the bakery in the morning, but there's like a bus that will come to this ranger station trailhead and pick you up and like take you into the town that's, I think it's like 6 or 8 miles, 9 miles from this trailhead. So it's a little bit of a ways. So you don't just want to like stroll into town.
Right.
And so, I went, pitched my tent, went to sleep, woke up in the morning, like the bus comes around like 8 or 9 in the morning. And so I'm sitting there at the bus area waiting. and a few backpackers had shown up too. And so we're, there's a group of us waiting to take this bus into town. And, an hour goes by, the bus still isn't there, and we're all kind of confused. And finally, kind of the ranger popped out of its little ranger station and said there was, because of all the rain, a huge mudslide had come down and was blocking the road. And so the bus can't come, and I am just like devastated. Like, I have been dreaming of like cinnamon rolls for like the last few days, and I'm like, this cannot be happening. And so the backpackers and myself, apparently the mudslide was like a mile or two down the road. And so we start walking down the road towards the mudslide, because we're like, if we can just get on the other side of it, we can then probably make it to town.
Yeah.
We get to the mudslide, and it was just like brown soup that had like come across the road. And it was like basically, in the deepest parts, it ended up being kind of like almost like hip high on me.
Oh my goodness.
And so all of us stripped down, we all took off our pants, and we're just in our underwear and barefoot, and we're just like, for a couple 100 feet, just walking through ice cold, like wet mud. And I'm just like, I am getting to this bakery. Yes. This is happening.
Too far in now.
Yeah, and my resupply box is there too. So I'm like, I need to get my resupply box. I need the cinnamon roll. Make it through the mud. And then they had like a trail crew that they had some bulldozers that they were working on clearing the mudslide. And so then I was able to like hitch a ride in the back of a truck, because no one was going to let us into their car after we had just walked through a mudslide. But then we hitched a ride in the back of a truck the rest of the way into the bakery, and I just like get into this bakery finally. So that was probably for sure one of like my favorite stories, just because of like the whole arc of just the circumstances and just like another thing happening, and then finally making it into this bakery. And it was, I was so happy.
Was the cinnamon roll worth it?
It was absolutely worth it. I think
got more than one.
Yeah, I absolutely did. And I like packed them out with me too. Like I spent probably like over $100 in this bakery just stocking up. Yeah, it was
awesome.
And I've gone back since, and nothing tastes as good from that same bakery as it did that time. After all the adversity it took to get to that bakery, it definitely made it taste like 10 times better, and I'll never have a cinnamon roll as good as that one, even if it's from the same bakery, because I never had to work as hard to get it as that time. Yeah.
Gosh. All right, so we know that you're always looking towards the future. What's on your horizon? What's coming up next?
Well, I've had a couple young horses that I raised from like weanling, and they're 5 this year, and so they're really just kind of starting to get out there. And so I would say that's probably the most exciting thing on the horizon is I'm gonna have them be like kind of my new, full-time partners and starting to go out with me. So that's very exciting. It's also exciting to kind of be getting towards the end of what has felt like a very long period of having like up and coming horses, and just the training and the time and patience that goes into that. So I'm pretty excited to be at a point where the training is, coming to be a little bit less in terms of like the baby stuff, and having like a real established partner, because I was very spoiled when I did that first Mexico to Canada ride. I had my mare for 9 years, and then I had her son who I had raised, and he was 7 on that first ride. And so I had really established partnership with my horses. And then, there became a point where now I'm having to kind of like restart and like you very much go back to the bottom and then work your way back up. And so that has kind of been the last few years of my life, has been kind of like this rebuilding to get back to almost in a sense with my horses where I had started.
Yes.
So it's been strange. Like I had such a great horse partnership and zero backcountry knowledge, and I really had to like build up the backcountry knowledge, and then I've almost had to go back down with the horse stuff. And I'm kind of excited to get back to this place that I felt a little bit like I had, a couple years ago. In my trips. And then, I have a couple, hopes for some big rides for them. I don't have any Mexico to Canada rides planned lately. My last Mexico to Canada ride really felt like I had kind of like, I don't want to say closing a chapter, because I do see myself, quite a ways in the future doing another Mexico to Canada ride. But in terms of this kind of like insatiability that I had for a good decade of doing Mexico to Canada's has a bit like waned. And now what I really love doing is, finding these little kind of like pockets of just huge beauty for me. Because on a Mexico to Canada ride, not all of it is beautiful. You definitely go through sections where you're just trying to get from point A to point B. And I call them I give them like star ratings, and I call those 2 to 3 star views. And then, once or twice a week, you'll have like a 5-star view on like a Mexico to Canada ride. And I am now just kind of like really chasing those 5-star views. And so I travel all over the West now during my summers of like places that I never got to go when I was on those Mexico to Canada rides, or my favorite places I get to go back and visit that were those 5-star places. And so that's kind of been what I've really been looking for these last couple years, is these like hidden gems that I never got to go to, places that, because I still love that, that saying of like, there's nothing like riding through new country on a fine horse. Very true. And I would say for me, that's kind of more what I chase now than like just the sheer distance of going Mexico to Canada. That for a while was so unknown to me that was exciting, but it's become less unknown. And so I would still just love the feeling of like riding through a beautiful place that I've never seen before and sharing that experience and making those memories with my horses. So I hopefully will be doing quite a bit in Idaho this next summer, is like high on my list. I'll see if I can make it out there in time, but I always have kind of like a bucket list of places and routes that I have like, saved on my computer. And so I've got quite a few in Idaho that I'm going to try to check off this next year. I have one in Colorado. I'll see if I make it out for that one. But yeah, there's always kind of like, a never ending list. As you check things off, you add more to it. So Idaho is going to be big on my list, and just really getting to enjoy this kind of like new level of partnership that I'm getting to with my younger horses.
Awesome. So something we ask all our guests, and you kind of covered it, but I'm going to ask it in a different sense, kind of. What's something specific that you are looking forward to in the next few months?
Next few months. Well, the biggest thing that's like at least on the forefront of my mind is I'm kind of like looking at some properties to maybe relocate to.
That's awesome.
So areas
Very
that like I
exciting.
sort of know but have just never lived in.
Yes.
So kind of looking at that. That's definitely the forefront of like my most immediate future is going to
Yes.
be a lot of time just exploring the very new local area that we might be moving to, and we're kind of getting a fixer-upper, so might have a lot of like home projects.
Yes.
And then once hopefully we've gotten to a better place by the time spring rolls around, getting to go out and like I said, Hell's Canyon is probably top of my list. I'm kind of have my eyes on there for like May. I was there once in the fall, and it was like really gorgeous in terms of like it was October, and so some places were getting quite cold, but it was like 80s and warm, and I got to go swimming. In May, it probably will not be swimming weather, but Hell's Canyon gets really, really green and has wildflowers. And so to see it at that time of year, I'm pretty excited about that.
Awesome. So another follow-up, what are your top 3 things that you cannot live without?
Top 3 things. Probably one would be like my jet boil, which is like a little backpack country stove. That, again, when I've described these times where I'm having like a really, really bad time on trail or something, especially if I'm coming in late, the thing that I would be looking forward to like most would be like at some point today, this will be over, I'll be in my tent and I'll be warm and I'll be, eating something hot or having a hot cup of tea, having just like that. It becomes like a creature comfort. You have very few things when you're out there that are comfortable. And so you have an enormous appreciation for anything that gives you this little bit of comfort. So like one for me is definitely my jet boil, and being able to have hot food and hot drinks brings me enormous comfort when I'm out there, especially if I've been cold and wet all day. So that's going to be a common theme in answering this question. It's going to be my favorite things are the things that give me little bits of comfort. Another huge one is probably in general, like the thing, food is a big one. Like I will, have my favorite foods, and you kind of find yourself like parceling them out when you're like, at the end of the section. I'll often reward myself either after a really, really hard day or on the last night of kind of like, before I'm going to have like a layover somewhere, I'll have like my favorite meal that last night. So it's like I can like kind of like give myself that reward of like, ooh, I'm going to have this meal to look forward to.
Yes.
Definitely like chocolate and candy. I joke that I usually eat like a 10-year-old that was set loose in like a convenience store gas station.
I love that.
Is a lot of my diet on trail. And then probably lastly for sure would be my saddle. You are sitting on this saddle for, like a minimum of 8 hours a day practically. And on my first Mexico to Canada ride, I'd never really shopped for saddles, and the saddle I got had I kind of had like a scooped seat to it.
Yes.
And I really struggled with comfort in riding in my saddle. I walked so much because I just couldn't sit in my saddle for long periods of time. And I didn't know that it was like the saddle necessarily that was the problem. I thought maybe this is just how it was to ride long distance. Yeah, and just again got off and walked, and didn't necessarily know that it could be different than that. And then ended up trying a different saddle for my second Mexico to Canada ride, and that was a lot more comfortable for me, and the main difference was like the seat. And so I was like, oh, this seat really matters, but it wasn't necessarily, I couldn't quite get it to fit my horse as ideally as I wanted to. I even had it like custom fitted for her, and it still wasn't just quite coming together. And so then my third one, I actually, because I was just buying a lot of used saddles online because that's what my budget allowed, and then trying them on my horse, and it's very hard to know if you have as ideal of a fit as you need until you're making that horse carry that saddle for 8 hours a day. Like you'll think you have a good fit, but you can't really tell if you have a great fit until you're putting in those miles. And by then, you can't just go around swapping out saddles in the middle of a big trip like that because you might make it worse. So after like 2 Mexico to Canada rides, I kind of like started feeling like I really wanted to get that piece figured out. Because that kind of felt like the one piece in my whole system that was still not where I wanted it.
Yes.
And so I reached out to Tucker Saddles, and I just messaged them, told them what I was doing with, saddles, and how I was kind of having, like, I just couldn't quite seem to get it right. And would they be willing to basically, help me find like that perfect fit for me and for my horse. And they were so kind. Like I did not have any social media presence. I had nothing to give them basically other than my like endorsement that, yeah, this is great.
Right.
They really weren't going to get anything out of the deal with me at that time, but they were so willing, to send me a saddle. We ended up trying 2 different tree sizes, and the second one was just an absolute perfect fit on my mare. And she was a quarter horse, and it ended up the tree that fit her best was a gated tree. And she had a kind of an unusual walk to her, and definitely, now that I understand a little bit better, more of like a gated horse almost kind of build to her, so I can see why that tree fit her best.
Yes.
And it was just thanks to Tucker Saddles that we ended up having the saddle that I could ride in all day, that my horse, she never, ever, ever had any back tenderness once we got that saddle. And so for sure, for comfort for me and for my horse, my saddle is probably like the most functional, important piece of gear that I have.
That's so good to hear.
Yeah, that's great to hear when it all comes together like that.
Yes, yeah. And then it's worked out for all my future horses too to stick with Tuckers because they've had such a variety of trees and fits that I now know the saddle that I love, which is a Horizon Outpost endurance saddle, and I'm able to then find that saddle, even if it's a different tree, to kind of cover the spectrum of horses I have. So that's also been great because now I can have still my favorite saddle, but have it fit my horses just depending on what tree they end up needing.
Yes.
So I've been able to like now have the same saddle and not just have to constantly kind of like reinvent the wheel every time I have a different horse that I'm trying to ride.
Yeah, that has to be a huge like mental relief.
Yes,
for
it
sure.
is, absolutely.
Well, thanks for joining us for this episode of Inside the Circle podcast. Gillian, it was great to have you and talk with you today. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and we will see you on the next one.
Bye.